Hello everybody and welcome to my second of 3 videos on this, the Canon EOS Rebel T3i, also called the 600D outside of North America, except in Japan where it was called the KISS X5. So in the first video we talked about what everything on the camera is. In this video we're going to talk about what everything does except for the menu system, which we'll cover in the third video. Before we do anything with this camera, it is fully electronic. You can't do anything unless you have a good battery in it. So I'm going to show you how to change the battery. Battery chamber door here is here on the bottom. To change the battery, you simply open up the battery chamber door, and then here's the battery. To remove it, just push this off to the side, and a spring under the battery will push it up and away. So you can lift it out, or honestly use gravity. Turn this right side up and just tap this into your hand, and that'll work. So it uses a Canon LP E8 battery, which you can see right here. And I don't know if Canon still makes these or not, but this was a pretty standard battery for this time period of their digital SLRs of this tier. So you can still get these at minimum third-party if you wanted to do that. And as you can see, this is a third-party battery. Okay, so to install it, there's a couple different ways you can do it. Well, actually, that's not true. There's only one. There's a couple of different ways you can't do it. Obviously, this part goes down into the camera. You can see down there inside the camera there are some gold dots, and there are also a receiver down here on this side that has some gold pins. The pins connect to this. I believe the dots are for a battery for an AC adapter. So to put it in, you simply put it in this orientation and push it in. If you put it in the wrong way, it will not let you install it the whole way. So you can only install it and have it click into place if you put it in the correct way. There we go. And that's how we change the battery. Next thing that we're going to do, having changed the battery, is I'm going to show you how to change lenses on this camera. So here's the lens release button. To remove a lens, you push this in, and then you turn the lens counter or anti-clockwise until it stops, and then remove it. You will have noticed here, and if you saw the first video, I pointed out the red circle and the white square. EF lenses, EFS lenses. EFS lenses are pretty easy to identify because they have the white square. They're not trying to make this hard. It'll also say EFS on the front of the lens. Mounting an EF versus an EFS lens is the same. So if you had an EF lens, it would have a red dot here instead of a white square, and you just line up red dot to red dot. Because I have an EFS lens, I'll put it here, white square to white square. The difference between EF and EFS lenses is EF are full frame lenses that herald from the film era, the original design of them, of the mount that is. And then the EFS lenses are specifically for APS-C digital cameras. Now once you have your lens in place, you turn it clockwise until it clicks into place and you can't move it, and now you've changed your lenses. Having a battery in the camera rather, and a lens mounted, we can now put in, you could do it at any point, but we are now in this video's chronology going to install a memory card so you can save your photos. First thing to do to get to the memory card is we open it up right here and lift it up, and this is the memory card slot. You'll be able to see, I think here, there's a design of a memory card shape on the door that tells you how the memory card's inserted, just like that, so that if you're looking at the back of the camera, you can read the text on the memory card. Push it in. Once it's clicked into place, you can now close the door, and you've loaded your memory card. To remove your memory card so that you can copy your files to your computer, simply open the door, push to eject, just like it says right there. And now you can remove your memory card and put it in your computer and transfer your files over. The Canon T3i uses the SDXC memory card, which is standard, which is what this is. And you can see that because, does that say it? No, this is an SDHC, I'm sorry. Up here on the memory card, whatever brand you have, somewhere on it, it should say SDHC or SDXC. That's the standard of the memory card. This camera can use up to SDXC, which are the fastest and largest of the SD cards, which have a single row of contacts on the back of them. If your memory card has a double row of contacts on them, this camera will not be able to recognize it. SDXC memory cards are up to 2 terabytes in size. And I tested this with a 256 gig memory card. It worked just fine, and it was able to hold more than 8,200 raw files on that 256 gig card. So if you got a 128, which run about $10-15 brand new, you'll still be able to hold more than 4,000 raw files on this camera. So you don't have to buy the most expensive, biggest memory card you can find. A 128 is going to be more than suitable for what this camera can do. Next thing we're going to talk about is how to use the flash. Now up here on the top of the camera, this is your flash hot shoe. And I'll turn it around so you can see it. This is where you can connect the flash to your camera. There is no secondary port. There's no PC port. The only other option, of course, is to is to use the pop-up flash if you wanted to. We'll talk about why you shouldn't in just a minute, though. So this is the flash port. There are 5 contacts on here. The center big one right here is the one that actually triggers the flash to fire. That's the trigger port. These 4 here allow the camera to communicate with the flash. I can't tell you what all of these little 4 contacts do. One of them I think is like a ground port. One of them is a ready indicator that lets the flash know when lets the camera know when the flash is ready to fire. These I forget for sure what these 2 do, but I think they may have to do with metering and things like that. So at any rate, that's what this port is and what it does. You can use any Canon flash. I don't happen to have one, so this is the flash that I use in all of these videos. As you can see, it has only the single contact down here. As a general rule, old flashes like this one have very strong capacitors compared to modern flashes and shouldn't be used directly on a DSLR because they can back charge from the flash into the DSLR and short out the board. It doesn't happen often, but it's a risk, especially with bigger, more powerful old flashes than this one. And that's simply a matter of the circuitry in these old flashes not having the protections that are needed to prevent that. Old film cameras, they could handle that discharge. They didn't care. They didn't even know it happened. But modern digital cameras, they will know it happened. So, at any rate, no batteries in here. It's completely safe to mount this. So let me turn that off. To mount a flash onto your camera, you're just going to slide it into the hot shoe, tighten it down just like that, and now you've mounted your flash into your camera. As we talked about in the beginning, I think I talked in the first video, the flash sync speed on this camera is 1/200th of a second. And with Canon flashes, with Canon branded modern flashes, that's not so much of an issue because insofar as I know, and I'll admit I'm not an expert on Canon flashes, but insofar as I know, they all communicate back to the camera so that the camera will not fire faster than it can actually manage, or it will have a high-speed sync. We're going to talk really basic about how flash works just to understand some of the concepts. So when I say that the flash sync speed is 1/200th of a second, what that means is that is the fastest shutter speed at which the curtain is open. The sensor is exposed to light for the entire duration of the exposure. So when you have different shutter speeds, you actually have curtains over your sensor. And when you take a picture, the first curtain opens, and then your exposure occurs, and then the second curtain closes, and then they reset like that. So when you use 1/200th of a second for your flash sync, the first curtain opens, the entire sensor is exposed to light for about a 200th of a second, during which time the flash fires, then the second curtain closes, and then they reset just like that. Okay. If you took a picture, let's say at 1 full second, the first curtain would open, the sensor would be exposed to light for a full second, and then the second curtain would close, repeat. But if you're at 1/4000th of a second, the first curtain would open, and then the second curtain would follow right behind it very closely. And that the reason that this is a faster shutter speed isn't because the curtains move faster. It's because the gap between the curtains shrinks. So if you imagine at a 30-second shutter speed, that gap is 30 seconds long. At a 4,000th of a second shutter speed, that gap is a 4,000th of a second long. So if you used a standard flash without high-speed sync at a 1/4000th of a second shutter speed, you just have a really narrow area of exposed image, and then everything else would be blocked by the shutter curtains and completely blacked out. So that's the basics of flash sync. And like I said, some of that is not applicable if you're using a Canon branded flash that will work directly with your camera. But all of that Canon flash specific stuff is beyond the scope of this video. Now, all that said, let's talk about some basic flash technique that can set you up to have the best results from your flash photos. The worst possible place to have a flash is where this one is mounted or this pop-up one is placed, okay? Having a flash directly above the lens is going to set you up to have flat and waxy photos with red eye. Why, though? So let's say you're taking a picture of a person looking at the camera. If you fire the flash, it's going to leave the flash, it's going to reach your subject, and then it's going to reflect off of your subject, bounce off, and then whatever word you want to use, back to your sensor. Well, a wall of photons reflected back as a wall of photons, that's a very flat lighting. And it's not flattering to the way we think about things looking. If you think about how we see things outside with the sun above us, indoors with the lights from on our ceilings and lamps above us, we're used to seeing people being lit from above, and so our brains equate being lit from above with a normal and flattering look, and that's why this orientation is not a good setup. Okay, so what are a few things you can do to get rid of that issue? And I'll show you one right now. When you buy a flash, if you get one that can tilt like this, now you can bounce the flash off of the ceiling and replicate that overhead lighting look. Okay, in addition, but you're not always going to have a ceiling. So some flashes, in addition to being able to tilt, the head can also swivel. This is not one of those. So if you don't have a ceiling, but you do have a wall, you could swivel it and tilt it and get something that's kind of like overhead lighting. And that can also, it actually would technically, I think, be closest to Rembrandt lighting, but it can be very flattering. So Rembrandt lighting is above and beyond the scope of this video. Anyway, that's something you can do. You can either bounce off the ceiling or bounce off a wall. Another thing you can do is if you have an RF receiver in your hot shoe, at that point, if with an RF receiver that doesn't have a wired connection, you can use old flashes safely, by the way. But because this is an autofocus camera, with an RF trigger, you can handhold your flash and let your camera autofocus and take your photo this way. And that way you can put the light exactly where you want it to be and replicate natural lighting. That's a really powerful use of flash, is to buy an inexpensive RF trigger and use that. So I guess the best takeaway I've got for you is if you have to put your flash on top of your camera, make sure you have one with a tilting and swiveling head. And if you want to have the best results from your flash, never ever use your pop-up flash or a flash that points straight forward. Okay, so having talked about some of those basic operations, the next thing I want to do is show you how to set the ISO on the camera. So let me flip out the screen here and turn this on. And you can see, where is it on here? It's got to be, here it is. No, ISO D+200. I have somehow turned dynamic auto onto this. We'll fix that later, I'm sure. Okay, ISO. I'm going to push down the ISO button, and now I can select anything from auto to 6400 by using the top command wheel. Just going to rotate here. So in video 3, I'll show you how to set a range for the auto. So instead of being 200 to 6400, you could make it 200 to 800. Or you could just select a specific ISO yourself. So that's how you set the ISO. Basically with ISO, the higher the number, the less light you need. But with digital cameras, the higher the number, the more digital noise you're going to get. So you're going to get your best image results in terms of digital noise reduction at your lowest number. To give you an example of what that means, if you took this camera outside and you had full sun with the sun to your back and you set your lens at f16, then at 200 ISO you'd need a shutter speed of about 1/200th of a second for a proper exposure. At 6400 ISO you'd need a shutter speed of about 1/6400th of a second to get a proper exposure. This camera can't even reach a shutter speed that fast. So higher number, less light; lower number, more light; higher number, more digital noise; lower number, less digital noise; higher number, faster shutter speed than a lower number in the same amount of lighting. All right, next thing we're going to talk about is a little bit complex and in-depth, so we're going to go through everything here on the mode dial. And I'm going to explain what all of the different modes are. We're going to start here with A-DEP. I'm going to be right up front with you. I've not used A-DEP. It's not a mode that I use, but I'll tell you the function of it is it's called automatic depth of field. And what it does is allow you to set up a series of subjects. So let's say you're out taking a landscape photo and you've got a rock. You want to do it portrait orientation, right? So you've got a rock down here and a lake down here and a mountain up here. And A-DEP will look at the rock and the lake and the mountain, and it'll figure out what depth, what aperture you need to get all of that in focus, probably f16 or f22. Or another example, let's say you've got a portrait of 3 friends, right, standing in a row. And you can have one here who's about 2 feet in front of the middle one, and then one over here who's about 2 feet behind the middle one, and the camera will look at those and figure out the best aperture to get all of them in focus. So it's a useful tool to be able to take a shot and make sure that what you want to have be in focus is going to be in focus on that shot. Full manual mode is where the camera is going to let you select all the settings. Aperture, shutter speed, ISO, whatever you want to set, the camera is going to let you do that. And if they're right, it'll give you a good photo. And if they're wrong, it doesn't care. It's going to give you a bad photo. So if you're in a dark concert and you set your aperture to f16, which is a very small opening, needs a lot of light, and your shutter speed to 1/4000th, which is very fast, this camera is going to do that and all of your photos will be completely black. Likewise, if you're outside during the day and you set your shutter speed to 1 second and your aperture to f1.4 and your ISO to 6400, it's going to give you a whole bunch of photos that are just white. So with manual, you have to use the exposure, the light meter rather, to get a proper photo. So here I'm going to show you how to adjust all of the settings in manual. By default, when you rotate the command wheel here, you're going to adjust the shutter speed, just like that. If you push the AV button on back, I'm guessing this is it. Yes, it is. I guessed correctly. Now you can adjust the aperture with the command wheel. Okay, just like that. And if you have to press the shutter button, we'll should see the light meter pop up. This camera is set up to turn off the display when I push the shutter button, but when I push the display, you can see there that for a second, there's a little bar underneath that scale there. And you'll see that in the viewfinder as well. Basically, in manual mode, your objective is to get that bar underneath the center here. If the bar is over on this side, your images are going to skew on the bright side. The further it is, the brighter they'll be. If that bar is over on this side, your images are going to skew to the dark side. The further it is, the darker that your images will be. So that's how you read the meter, and that's how you make the adjustments. Aperture priority is going to give you a proper exposure, and you can control the aperture. So as you can see here, I'm setting the aperture, and the camera is going to pick the best shutter speed to give me a proper exposure with this. So if you just have this set up like it is right now, it will always give you a proper exposure. And if your shutter speed is 30 seconds or 1/500th of a second, it'll do that to give you a proper exposure. I'm going to push the AV button here and then adjust the command wheel on top. And what I can do is force the camera to give me a darker image or a brighter image, just like that. Okay, so where is this going to be useful? Let's say you're out on a snowy field or at the beach, very bright scenes with a lot of light. Your camera will try to make those darker and grayer. So if you do that, your snow fields might come back looking a little bit grayish. But if you force overexpose your images with this, then you'll get brighter white snowfields. Another good way to use this is if you're sitting under the awning at a cafe with a bright background. Your camera is going to meter off that background. But if you allow it to do that, and then you add a couple of stops of light, just like this, now what's going to happen is what's in the shade in that cafe with you, the person you're sitting with, for instance, will now be more properly illuminated, and you'll have a better image of that person at the cost of the bright background behind them. So pushing the AV button and adjusting the command wheel allows you to intentionally over or underexpose with aperture priority shooting, or AV, aperture value as Canon calls it. TV stands for time value, or shutter priority in general terminology, and in this you can control the shutter speed with the command wheel instead of the aperture, and the camera will pick an aperture that is needed to give you a proper exposure. When you look through your viewfinder, if your aperture number blinks, your camera is telling you that your lens does not have an aperture that's in the range that's needed. So for instance, if you are at 400 ISO and you're in full sun and you set this to 30 seconds, your camera does not have a small enough aperture to give you a proper exposure. And so your aperture will blink, and you just have to adjust your shutter speed until you come up with an aperture in your viewfinder that's not blinking. Okay, so then now that's what that tells you with the blinking aperture. With aperture priority, a blinking shutter speed means the same thing, but because you have a much wider range of shutter speeds with this camera than you do with apertures, it's less likely that you'll see that. So. And if you're guessing that if you push down the AV button on the back, now you can force over or force underexpose your image, just like I described in the AV mode discussion. Exactly the same functionality. Program mode means the camera is going to pick the best aperture and shutter speed combination for you. And what specific aperture and shutter speed it picks are based on some computing magic built into the camera that I can't tell you exactly what triggers it to use a specific aperture or shutter speed. That's generally proprietary information that no one outside of Canon's going to have access to. So that's why these went dark. And like AV and TV, if I hold down the AV button on the back, now I can again force over and underexpose the image just like that. And that's going to give me a little bit of control in program mode for how my exposure is going to turn out. A+, they call it Scene Intelligent Auto, or Magic Green Box, as a lot of photographers call it. This is where the camera is going to do everything for you. This is basically the equivalent of shooting with a cell phone. So if you just come to this camera from a cell phone and you're intimidated by it, and you want to learn how to use the buttons without worrying about whether or not your photos are going to turn out well, just switch it in A+ for a few days, learn the interface, and that will help a lot. Then afterwards, you can move into these creative zone modes. I will tell you that 99% of my shooting is done in, well, not 99, the vast majority of my shooting is done in aperture priority mode. With digital, I almost exclusively use aperture priority. With film, I do almost exclusively manual, because most of my cameras don't have light meters. But most of your shooting should be done in these modes up here, because these are the ones that are going to teach you the most about making quality photos. Program's a good one to step into after Magic Green Box if you're just learning, and then trying the semi-automatic modes of TV and AV, and then learning manual mode, really learning how to take a good manual exposure, is going to teach you a lot about how cameras work and how images are captured well. So anyway, so Magic Green Box just does everything for you. Now, if we go down here, these are the scene modes. They're generally called on Canon DSLRs. This first one is called flash off. They're not trying to trick you with what this does. It literally just turns off the flash. It's green box with no flash. Green box will pop up your flash and fired automatically. So if you're like your kids play or something like that, you do not want to use green box. You'd want to use flash off. Next one is called Creative Auto. Okay, so Creative Auto is a mode that allows you to set up some creative parameters. Now, all of these ones down here have creative parameters. I'll describe as we get through them. But if we see here, there's this button that says Q. Which one's Q? This one. So if I push the Q button, now I can use the cross pad to scroll into this setting right here, which is called background blur. Moderate background blur, right? Or sharply focused background, or very blurry background. So you can set how much background blur you want your camera to deliver in your mode. Drive mode. If I hit OK, now I can select any of the drive modes, which we talk about later in this video. Yes, we do. We talk about those later. We haven't done them yet. I would hope I'd know that if we had done them yet. Anyway, you can set the drive mode. Flash, you can also set the flash mode to auto, on, or off. Automatic means it will fire if it needs to. Flash means it will Flash on means it will always fire. Flash off means it will never fire. So this allows you to go into your creative modes and adjust some parameters. You can also go into standard settings and you can adjust some of the color toning in here. So some of these are pretty self-explanatory. I don't think they try to hide what any of them do with the names. Monochrome makes your images monochrome. Cool is going to give them like a bluish, greenish, cool tone cast, for instance. Warm will give them an amber orange cast. Vivid is going to bump up the contrast and the saturation. And standard is just your standard setting. So you can adjust some of the ways that the images look through this as well. Next up here we have portrait mode. Now with these modes as well, if you hit all of these modes, by the way, I think maybe with the exception of movie mode, we'll see that in a minute, but with the rest of these creative modes, if you hit the Q button, you can come in here and you can adjust some of the parameters that it will let you adjust, such as the color toning. It'll let you adjust some of your different settings. These are time of day or color, different lighting conditions, for instance, whether you're in daylight or shade, for instance. And it can also allow you to adjust your drive mode, whether or not you're using a self-timer or you can pick, whether you're using a self-timer or self-timer continuous. This way you could take like photos where you're in them. Use a remote control, for instance. So at any rate, it will not let you do single shooting, by the way, in portrait mode unless you're using self-timer. And the reason is that if you're doing a burst mode, then what you can do is get lots of photos of your subjects and then just find the photo or photos with the people or person in it where they're not blinking and everybody's smiling. So that's why that's in burst mode. So some things you can do in portrait mode to give you the best results are use the long end of your kit lens. So if you have the 18 to 50 millimeter or 18 to 55, whatever it is, use that 50 or 55 millimeter length. If you have the 70 to 200 that came with a lot of these, or whatever that focal length was, try something in the 100 to 200 millimeter range. And those longer lengths give you an image look that is more flattering to human subjects. Another thing you can do to set this up for success is have your subject be at least 9 to 10 feet in front of the background behind them. One of the things that this mode's going to do is select an aperture that will get the person in focus and then have a blurry background. But if your person is standing, let's say, right where this head is, and then the background is this blue wall, there's not very much distance there, so that person's going to be in focus, and then that background is also going to be in focus. But if your person's standing here where this head is, and then the background is back here, like maybe this blue cue box, that's going to be blurry and out of focus because the aperture that the camera is going to use in your lens is the one that's needed to only get the person's head in focus. The further away that you get from that person, then the blurrier things will be. And so the closer that something is, the less blurry it will be, even though it won't be in perfect focus. So that's a good tip for this, is just to make sure that you're using a longer focal length lens and that your person is standing 10 feet away or 10 feet or more from the background. Next up is landscape, and you can make all of the same setting adjustments down here that you could, except that you cannot turn on the flash with this one. Landscape disables flash use. But you can adjust your default your coloration settings, and you are also limited to single shot mode in this one. Single shot shooting, I believe, in this. So let's see if I'm right. Yeah, single shot, self-timer, or self-timer continuous. So wasn't far off. Anyway, with landscape, what this is going to do is this is going to aim to get everything in the scene in focus. So it's going to use a small aperture and a longer shutter speed. So What you can do to make this scene successful, this type of image successful, is have a tripod, because otherwise you risk getting shutter shake or image shake for having a long exposure. And in addition, the other thing you can do is compose your image to have a pleasing landscape photo. So a couple of things you can do with to make a pleasing landscape are have something in the foreground that's close up and something in the background that's distant. So if you have a distant mountain range here and you have up close here like a bunch of wildflowers, that can be a much more successful photo than if you just take a photo of some mountains and that's all that's in the image. So the other thing you can do to make landscapes really interesting is use wide lenses. So if you have the kit 18 to 55, use the 18mm length on that lens to get the most dramatic landscapes you can get. This next mode is called close-up, and this is designed to be used at the closest focus point of your lens. So let's say you wanted to take a picture of a flower, which is why they have the flower here. You'd set your lens to 50mm for the kit 18 to 50 and get as close as you can, and your camera will focus. Now, all lenses have a minimum focus distance, so if your flower is like pressing up against the front of your lens, you're not going to get it in focus. But if you have the 18 to 50mm or 1855, whatever it is, the kit zoom lens at 55, at the longest focal length, and you're about a foot away, you can probably get that flower in focus. This next mode is called sports, and this is designed to freeze action in sports shooting. This works best with a telephoto. So on the kit lens, the long end will be the best, or if you have that 70 to 200, anything in that range, but specifically closest to the 200 is going to work best. This will use a large aperture, so it can make the shutter speed as fast as possible to freeze the motion of the sports. Night portrait is a very specific setting, and this is used to capture a portrait of a person with a nighttime scene behind them. This is not for Milky Way photography, but if you have someone that you're talking to, you want to take a portrait of them, and you have a cityscape in the background, and there's a bunch of buildings lit up, this is the mode that you want. Might also be able to use this for fireworks. I'd never thought about that, but that would be an interesting use. Anyway, the way that this works is it takes a long exposure and fires the flash. So what's going to happen is your person will be illuminated by the flash, and then the lights of the city behind them will be illuminated by the long exposure, because the long exposure will let more light in. What you want to do to set yourself up to be successful here is tell your person not to move until after you've taken the photo. You take the photo, the flash will either fire at the beginning or the end of the photo. I forget which. I think the beginning. And then tell them not to move until you tell them to. After the photo's taken, then you tell them to move and they can move. Why is that? Because if they move during the photo, all of the lights that were behind them from the city will shine through them. Okay? So the flash will illuminate them and make them sharp, and as long as they stay there and don't move, the flash is the part of them that's been illuminated by the flash is going to look just fine. And then the lights of the city will be visible behind them. And next we have movie mode, and you can see my old white shirt that I'm wearing, well, light blue. Anyway, movie mode pops you into live view and brings up your movie information. 1920, which is at 1080p, I think is what it's being recorded in, 30 frames per second, the amount of time you've recorded, that I don't have a card, proper exposure, because this is in one of the probably recording in program mode right now. So you can see here the 16:9 image ratio and what's going to be recorded in your video. Okay, so understanding what all the modes do, we do have one more button here on the top to discuss, and that's the display button. Has a single job. It turns the display on and off. It's no secret what that does. They didn't try to make anything mystical about it. So the info button here brings up your information screen. Okay, so we push the info button, it brings this up. And there's nothing you can do here, it's just going to tell you information. Free space is how much space is left on your SD card. I don't have an SD card, so it says 0 kilobytes. Color space, sRGB, standard RGB color space. White balance, shift, and bracketing is 0 and 0, means that I have no shifting and no bracketing set up for my white balance. That symbol right there is your dust, your sensor shake dust removal, telling us it's enabled. Oh, live view, I missed that. Live view shooting enabled means that if you're in live view, then you can take photos while in live view. Disabled means you can't. Okay, sensor cleaning. The go to sleep time is 30 seconds, which is why this camera keeps turning off. I'm going to fix that right now. Go to sleep 15 minutes, which is why this camera's not going to turn itself off quite so readily anymore. That's the Wi-Fi signal. No, that's got to be audio. I think that's the audio on-off. We're going to see we'll see that symbol again in the third video, and we'll see what happens when we enable and disable it. That I is, I believe, red eye reduction for your flash, which is disabled. And this is your automatic orientation on for both camera and computer, meaning that if you take a portrait orientation photo rather, you'll get letterboxing on the side of your playback on your camera, and then it'll be correctly oriented when you look at it on your computer. So this is just a bunch of settings at a glance, including your date and time. Okay, next button we've talked about a little bit. This is your AV button. In program, TV, and AV modes, this allows you to shift the exposure over and under. In manual mode, this allows you to hold it down to shift the aperture rather than your shutter when you're using the dial. So the AV button just has a couple of different uses, and that's what it does. The next button up here is your Asterisk button. And video 3 is going to show you a lot more about the Asterisk button because there's a whole menu item about it. When you push the Asterisk button, it will function as is described in video 3. I believe right now it is set up to auto exposure and autofocus lock, but we can change that, and when we get to video 3 and talk about this, I'll explain what each of the different options do and how to use them for your photography. This is your autofocus point selection button. So if we push it now and use the command wheel on top, oh come on, and use the command wheel on top, we can switch between the different autofocus points. Okay, or go back to all autofocus points. So we can mandate that the camera use a specific autofocus point. And you can see in your viewfinder, those autofocus points are marked. Let me make sure I'm not a liar. Ah, good, they're not. Okay. Not only are they marked, but they also light up to correspond with this if you're using your viewfinder instead of your LCD screen to make this adjustment. So what is this good for? Let's say, for instance, that you are at a basketball game, okay? And you're going to put the hoop right here on your autofocus point. You're going to use this autofocus point and line this up with the hoop. Okay. What's going to happen is that the autofocus will lock into the hoop, and you're going to look through your viewfinder, and you're going to use your right eye in your viewfinder and your left eye in the real world, and you're going to track the person who's running up to the hoop with your left eye. And as they start their dunk, you'll start your burst mode, and as they dunk, the hoop will be in focus, and so you'll be able to capture the photo. And you'll do that like 2 dozen times during the course of a game, and maybe you'll get 1 or 2 good photos out of it, because the frame rate being 3.7 frames per second and a dunk being a pretty quick thing, you'll just have to keep doing it. But that's one example of what that can be used for. Another one is, let's say you're at a corporate photo shoot, okay, and you want to be shooting in portrait orientation, and you want everyone's left eye to be in focus, or the space between their eyes or whatever, and you want to have every photo be framed exactly the same way. If you mandate this autofocus point and you put the bridge of their nose or whatever right here, then you know that every photo will be framed and focused at the same point, and you'll have nice consistent results across the entire shoot. So there's a bunch of different ways to use that, and that's why it's valuable. If you're just going to be shooting generally, letting the camera pick the autofocus point is going to be a pretty good result. In live view, if you push live view, it'll bring up what the camera can see, and then you get your displays, your controls over here as well to see what the exposure is going to be, your settings, and so on and so forth. And you can see that all it's recording right now is my desk. But with live view, you can also take photos if you have shoot from live view enabled and a memory card in the camera, so that you can shoot directly from live view and take pictures that way. Next button we're going to talk about is the Q button. If we push the Q button, that allows us to manually adjust specific things, except the manual mode, because that's adjusted by the dial. But what we can do is we can go through all of these different things and select ones to change. So let's go through what all of the information on the screen is and what happens when you change it. M, manual mode. If you're in AV mode or P mode, whatever, that's just going to display that. Shutter speed and aperture. Shutter speed is how fast the shutter is. Aperture is how large the aperture in your lens is. This is your ISO, and so you can adjust that again. Just like everything else, you can adjust it directly in here. This is your light meter. And what you can do here in your light meter is you can do exposure compensation and bracketing, right? So right now what this is telling you is it's going to take 3 photos. One that's a stop under, one that's properly exposed, and one that's a stop over. You can spread that out by up to 2 stops, and then you can close it this way. And we're going to switch to AV mode real quickly here, and you can see that if we go in here in AV mode, now we can access over and under exposure that way as well. This is your flash compensation. So if you are using a flash and you want to intentionally over or underclock your flash to give more power or less power, you can tell the camera to do that. These are your creative modes. We'll go back here again, creative modes. So you can adjust your creative modes directly through here, and these affect your JPEGs. This is your white balance setting, so you can come in here to select your white balance and use your white balance settings that way, same as by pushing the WB button. We'll talk about all the white balance options in a moment. Yeah, I'm not sure what goes in that blank area in the middle, if anything. Okay, this is your auto-correcting your image brightness, and basically what this does is this will give the camera the ability to either not minimally, somewhat, or maximally affect your color, your image lighting optimization. Basically, this is HDR light. So it'll boost your shadows, it'll drop your highlights, and if you do this, you can actually, if you just shoot raw and adjust these things in raw in post, you can do better than your camera can with less noise. If you've come to a DSLR to become a better photographer and have better image results, you'll probably want to start shooting raw sooner or later, and this is something you can do better in RAW. Next up here is your normal flash firing. This is going to affect how your flash fires. So shoot the built-in flash. This is going to be quick and easy wireless flash firing. And then this is going to be, you can customize your wireless flash. Now, I do not have any Canon flashes, so I don't use wireless flashes. I'm not the guy to ask about all of the intricacies of Canon flashes. There's a lot you can do with them, however. Manual focus, you can switch between manual and automatic focus, assuming that your camera's not switched to manual focus, or your lens rather. Now that I'm in autofocus on my lens, I can switch between one shot, AI focus, and AI servo. And we'll talk about what those are when we look at the autofocus mode button in a moment. Drive mode, which we're going to look at after this. Evaluative metering, so these are your metering mode selections, and what you can do is you can switch between the different metering modes. Evaluative is that 63 zone meter that we talked about at the beginning of the first video, where the camera takes the scene you're looking at right now, divides it into 63 modes, and picks the best exposure setting. Partial metering is one where you have a center area of about 9% here in the middle of the image, and that's where the majority of your, if not, or all, I think actually all of your metering information comes from. Spot metering is an area in the very middle of your image that provides 100% of the metering information. In video 3, we'll see it. I cannot remember off the top of my head whether or not spot metering is autofocus point linked on this camera or not. If it is, we'll see how to do that in video 3. And the last is center-weighted metering. And what center-weighted metering does is it takes an area in the center, and the majority of your metering information comes from that, and then the balance from around. Whether it's 60-40, 70-30, or 75-20, those are the 3 most common ones. I couldn't tell you, but that's the way that center-weighted works. And then here is your image size. So you can select between different formats: RAW, small, large, JPEG, things like that. Right in here, if you want to switch those on the go. And that is everything you can do with the Q button on this camera. Go back to manual, and now we're going to start talking about the different items on the cross pad. All right, white balance. So by pushing the white balance button, just like you saw with the Q button, we can now select the different white balance. Auto means that the camera is going to look at the scene and pick the best white balance for the scene. Daylight is best for full sun. Shade is best when you're taking photos, like say in the shade of a building, like they're showing here, shade of a tree, something like that, where the main lighting is sunlight, but you're shaded from it. Clouds are for on a cloudy day. Tungsten is for indoor tungsten lighting. Tungsten's not that common anymore. LEDs and CFLs are much more common, but this would be for something like a warm white LED. This would be a good one to use because this is going to up the blue in your images, which will counteract the warm tone of a tungsten or warm LED light. White fluorescent lighting. This is going to up the magenta in your images because fluorescents have a very strong green cast. So this is going to tell the camera you're in a fluorescent lighting setting and it needs to add more magenta. Flash. Flashes use a xenon bulb, which is why they're also called X flashes. That's a very blue light, so the camera is going to up the amount of amber in your images to counteract that blue light. Custom is an interesting setting, and I think it's video 3 where we see how to set it up, but I'm going to tell you what this does right now. When you select your custom white balance, you can create a custom white balance for your setting. So let's say you're going to do a corporate photo shoot. What you do is you grab a white card, or if you don't want to buy one, you're like, hey, corporate photo shoot client, can I grab a sheet of white copy paper? Sure thing, photographer. You put the white copy paper in front of your lens with the lighting that you have, and you take a photo of it to create your custom white balance. What that allows you to do then is have a white balance where the whites look white for the exact lighting you're going to use. This does require, for best results, steady state lighting. So let's say that you have ultra green fluorescence and the fluorescent isn't doing the trick to get rid of it. Then that's where you'd want to go with this. The other setting you can do with this is, let's say you have a tabletop studio and you're taking photos of crafts that you're selling online or just things that you want to share with your family, and you have a white box. You can take a photo of the white box with your lighting setup and save that as a custom setup, a custom white balance. And then whenever you go to take photos in that setting, just do that and you'll have a white balance that gives your thing that you're photographing the most accurate color rendition for the lighting that you have in that white box. So that's what those different options do. We're just going to leave it on auto. Next, we're going to do drive modes, which is this button right here. Single shot, continuous, remote with self-timer, and self-timer continuous. Okay. Single shot means that when you push the shutter button down, you'll take a photo. You can hold the shutter button down for the rest of your life and it photo. Continuous is you push the shutter button down and hold it, and the camera will keep taking photos at 3.7 frames per second until it hits the buffer, which is how much it can store in the memory before it cannot add more photos to the memory before other ones are cleared out. Self-timer with remote gives you, okay, so you cannot adjust the length of the self-timer, but it gives you a 10-second self-timer with a remote control trigger. This is just a 2-second self-timer. So I believe with this one you can hit the shutter button and get a 10-second self-timer, or you can use a remote. With this one here, you cannot use a remote, and I think that's the difference between the two of them. Self-timer continuous is the amount of time between each frame on your self-timer with your continuous shooting. Next up here, we're going to do the autofocus modes, and then we'll get to the modes at last on the back here. We're going to start with one shot. What one shot does, this is good for portraits. This will obtain focus when you have to press the shutter button. This will obtain focus, and focus will lock until you release the shutter button and go again, or take your photo. So if you're doing a portrait photo shoot and you have that autofocus point selected, this will use that autofocus point to obtain focus and then take your photo. AI focus is going to switch between one shot and AI servo as the camera thinks is appropriate to do. AI servo is going to be good for tracking moving objects, and what AI servo will do is use the camera's autofocus calculations and computers to track things that are moving in your scene so that they remain in focus. As you hold the shutter button down, focus will change. Whichever one you want to use for your setting is best. This last one here is going to be your creative modes. So just as a general statement, I never recommend using the creative modes. Just pick something like faithful or neutral or something like that and go with it. And the reason for that is because if you're shooting JPEG Once you add one of these creative mode tones to your image, you're stuck with it. It's going to be very hard to get rid of it. But if you have faithful or neutral and you open this up in post, you can then go and add different toning to it, and you have a lot more flexibility with editing your images. So if you lock yourself into something, you're just going to have to go with it. So these do not also, by the way, if you're shooting RAW, these don't apply to RAW. So it doesn't really matter which one you use. But again, just leaving it in one of the standard ones is going to give you the most flexibility for the images that you create with your camera. Okay, so the last three buttons here, play and delete. What these do is with play, if you push this, this will bring up any photos that you have on your camera's SD card, so you can scroll through them and take a look at your photos. Delete will allow you to delete a photo one at a time, or in certain folder views, you can delete an entire day. But these two buttons, anything that's in blue, only applies to when you're in play. With these buttons up here, when you're in play, you can scroll out, you can zoom in on specific parts of your images, or if you're looking at a single image and you hit zoom out, it will take you to a multi-image display. So that's what that does. Little icon here indicates that when you're in playback mode, this allows you to access and control how your images are going to be printed on a printer from your camera. Honestly, not something I've ever done. I've never connected a camera directly to a printer in my life, so print settings from your camera work. And then the last button here is, and all it really does is function as an OK button. I believe in video 3 we're going to see a menu item that allows you to assign a function to this, and I'm guessing that because I'm pushing this and nothing is happening, that this camera is assigned for the set button to have no. If my memory is correct on that, we'll see it in video 3. All right. And the last thing that we have to do with this camera before we move on to video 3 and talk about all the menu items is take a photo. Everything that we've learned up till now is designed to help you take a photo with this camera. The way that this camera is designed is that you dial in all of your settings, your modes, you set your aperture or shutter speed if you're using a mode that you do that with, one of the other or both. Pick your ISO, whatever settings you have, you've dialed them all in. Then when you go to take a photo, that's it. All you have to do is hold down the shutter button and just take photos until you run out of buffer space or whatever, however you're shooting. It's that simple. It's really designed to be a camera that you configure and then take photos with. So that's it for video 2. In the next video, we're going to go through all of the menu items. I'm going to discuss what all of the menu items are. I'm going to explain how they affect your photography and let you know, that will let you know what configurations you want to use to get the camera to behave in the way that you would like. See you in that video.